Hello and welcome everyone. We'll get just started in just another minute here. Hello and welcome to this really exciting and timely keynote event at American University. Why higher education must join the fight for reparations. My name is Malini Ranganathan, and I'm an associate professor at AU. I'm also the interim faculty director of AU's Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. This event is being co-hosted by the Office of the Provost and the Anti-Racism Center. Our distinguished speaker today is Dr. Earl Lewis from the University of Michigan, who will be introduced shortly by our acting provost and chief academic officer, Dr. Peter Starr. Before I turn it over to Provost Starr, I'd like to make a few brief announcements. This event is happening via Zoom webinar, which means that the audience's video and audio are automatically turned off. However, audience members can interact with the panelists via the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screens. Professor Brian McGowan in the School of Education will be moderating the Q&A session following the keynote. Live captioning will be available throughout the event. Please access this service by clicking on the CC closed captioning icon in your toolbar at the bottom of your screens. Finally, this event is being recorded and will be available for viewing and sharing in a few days. So with that, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to Dr. Lewis and turn it over to Provost Starr.
Thank you, Malini, and welcome. Before I introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, I'd like to express my gratitude to the interim leaders of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, Mellon Ranganathan and Christine Platt, for their extraordinary efforts to advance AU's anti-racist work across our schools and colleges this year. The ARPC's work, as you know, is central to the university's deep commitment to inclusive excellence. Malini and Christine's dedication to catalyzing anti-racist work among the center's fellows and well beyond has been exceptional by any measure. So please join me in thanking them for this important work. Many thanks too to our colleagues in the Provost's Office at the College of Arts and Sciences who supported the planning and execution of this event, including Chelsea Anderson, Carolyn Heinrich Teslar, Sarah Biggs, and Dylan Singleton. And a special welcome to AU trustee Mehdi Harabi and to faculty trustees Lizzie Warden and John Haywood. We're fortunate, as Malini said, to have with us today Dr. Brian McGowan, Associate Professor in the School of Education and Associate Director of Pedagogy and Higher Education Research in the Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning. Brian's going to be moderating this afternoon's Q&A. But it's a special pleasure for me to welcome to AU's virtual campus, Dr. Earl Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, African-American and African Studies, and Public Policy, and Director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan. From March 2013 to 2018, he served as president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. An author and esteemed social historian, he is also past president of the Organization of American Historians. From 2004 to 2012, Dr. Lewis served as Emory University's provost and executive vice president for academic affairs, and it's Asa Griggs Candler Professor of History and African American Studies. A fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a recipient of 11 honorary degrees, Dr. Lewis has held faculty and administrative appointments at the University of Michigan and the University of California, Berkeley. In addition to his service on a number of nonprofit and government boards, he chairs the board of regents of Concordia College, is a trustee at the Educational Testing Service, and serves as a director of 2U and the Capital Group American Funds. Dr. Lewis, we are delighted to welcome you to American University, where you've already made a real mark thanks to the Mellon Foundation sponsorship of our RISE initiative a number of years ago. And we very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Peter, and good afternoon to everyone. And I'm thoroughly appreciative of this invitation to speak. As we move day by day from the immediacy of this past election season and the horrific scenes of fellow citizens storming the Capitol building with the intention of wreaking havoc and ignoring facts, we are reminded of the importance of education, especially higher education. According to your official history at American University, when Methodist Bishop John Fletcher Hurst beseeched Congress to charter this institution, he sought to combine experiential learning, global leadership, and public service. Or, as your website notes, he sought to create a university that trained public servants for the future. Hurst could not have imagined this moment, but he did envision education in service of its times. And what times as we confront anew the ongoing toll of a health pandemic, the challenges of millions of unemployed in a world shaped by systemic macroeconomic change, as well as the lingering powerful pull of racist practices and racism. There's a part of me that hopes and trusts that this institution, in the spirit of its founding, is doing all in its power to address the confluence of all of these challenges, as well as others that have so far gone unnamed. But today, I want to talk about the latter in that change that I just recited, racism. However, unlike a lot of important, purposeful work that addresses how individuals may engage in self-reflection and vow to become anti-racist, I want to turn the focus instead onto institutions, namely this institution, and have it ask what it should be doing to adopt an anti-racist orientation. Here, I think the work is about more than seminars on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Don't mishear me, that without question, DEI work is hard and worthy. Yet, I continue to wonder, is it enough? Instead, what if we think of anti-racist engagement as an effort at institution-based reparations? In adopting such an approach, what do we gain? A quick perusal of online sources suggests that American University, notwithstanding its noble beginnings and early acceptance of African American students, needs more than a DEI framework going forward. Returning to a founding doctrine of educating students for future public service, I ask therefore, what greater service can there be than eradicating the lingering effects of racism in our lifetimes? Now, some have argued that we need not worry about this goal because demographics will take care of everything. They point to the work of demographers such as William Bill Fry, who projects a non-white majority in the nation by 2044. Now, Bill doesn't say this, but they extrapolate from his work, and in their accounting, numbers will result in more interaction, more acceptance, and ultimately, a world at peace with itself. Yet, an abundance of psychological literature, as well as work in intergroup relations research, show that proximity alone is insufficient to bring about the change desired. We need intentional programs with measurable outcomes and a focus to produce lasting shifts in attitudes and behavior. In effect, universities should move beyond simply educating and training for the future. More than ever, we need higher education to leverage its many, many assets to craft plans and designs for creating a just future or just futures. Commentators across the political spectrum have bemoaned the growing tribalism that threatens the body politic. How many have fully embraced the implications of the Case and Deaton thesis in Depths of Despair, their recent book? In that book, the authors argue, and I quote, as the college educated became wealthier and healthier, adults without a degree are literally dying from pain and despair. Now their work, end of quote. Now their work takes into account some of the underlying effects of automation and the lingering effects of the Great Recession, even if it doesn't take into full account the compounding effects of accelerated technological change on jobs. Almost all indicators project a decline in whole job families that have housed the working middle class and that will rival the deindustrialization of America that occurred in the 1970s and 80s. Worry about family and security means more than death and despair. It also gives credence to the blame and grievance culture that seems so ever present these last 4 or 5 years. So what's to be done? I argue, let's make a case for a just future that confronts the past. And as an example, I want to offer a model that we're developing just to do that very thing. The we in this instance is the center, and my colleague, the Center for Social Solutions, CSS, at the University of Michigan, and my colleagues there. At the center, we are poised to launch an innovative project that focuses specifically on and addresses racial inequality and its many manifestations. Founded in 2018, CSS was created to foster research and collaborations that diagnose and solve critical social problems. Our 4 founding issues, diversity and democracy, slavery and its aftermath, water equity and security, and the future of work, concern different forms of inequality that we believe must be addressed for the sake of advancing a more democratic society. So what are we about? We've just secured a multi-million-dollar grant that is to last for about 3 to 4 years. And it is designed to create and leverage a national network of colleges and universities to engage in college and university-based work involving humanities scholars working in partnership with community-based organizations to develop research-informed, community-engaged reparations plans for each location. This network of about 9 institutions is geographically dispersed and organizationally different. That is, these are colleges and universities that are spread across the United States. They employ the spectrum from senior humanists to graduate students and involve community fellows, as well as local organizations, and a collaborative public history reckoning designed to offer tangible suggestions and solutions for community-based reparations, racial reparations. Faculty and graduate students who participate stand to showcase the importance, in this instance, of humanities scholarship for tackling gnarly social problems, gain an opportunity to connect theory and practice, and demonstrate the value of humanities scholarship for crafting workable solutions. Community partners stand to gain a better appreciation of the colleges and universities in their communities, demonstrate that they too are intellectual workers, and will help produce a plan that speaks to the local history and suggests real options or solutions. Once completed, each site proposes to present findings and recommendations to local policymakers and provide detailed recommendations for implementation, somewhat akin to what has already occurred in Evanston, Illinois in 2019, and more recently in Asheville North Carolina in 2020. Just realized my computer unplugged. So this project, we're calling it Crafting Democratic Futures, situating colleges and universities in community-based reparation solutions. It emerges from our center's focus on slavery and its aftermath, and is informed by 3 generations of humanistic scholarship and what that scholarship suggests for all seeking just futures. We have come to learn that from that scholarship that African peoples who survived the transatlantic journey or Middle Passage entered the Americas with transferable knowledge and not just their labor. That the record shows slavery exacted a toll physically, emotionally, and psychologically. And upon exiting slavery, mindful of the need for resources, the formerly enslaved organized and demanded recognition of their plight and sought a kind of restitution or reparations. Rather than securing such reparations, in the main, most experienced further hardships, which the segregation era reinforced. Callie House, for example, worked tirelessly through the Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association in the pursuit of reparations. But rather than offering aid, the federal government charged her with fraud and other crimes and sent her to jail. And as W. Caleb McDaniel notes in his Pulitzer Prize-winning history, Sweet Taste of Liberty, only Henrietta Wood succeeded in bringing claims for false imprisonment during slavery and thereby earning formal financial reparations after slavery. The question of reparations for the descendants of enslaved African peoples in the Americas, especially in the United States, had until recently been part of a smaller effort seeking a broader audience, lingering on the other side of what is possible until the late 20th century. In 1987, some of you know, the federal government offered reparations to Japanese Americans interned during World War II and their descendants. It admitted that it wrongly declared them foreign agents and held them against their will in encampments. With this important gesture, the issue of reparations achieved new status in American life. The following year, then Congressman John Conyers, a late Democrat from Michigan, introduced a bill authorizing a commission to study the merits of reparations for African Americans. This legislation, known as H.R. 40, has been before Congress ever since. And upon John Conyers' departure from Congress, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has taken over of introducing this measure each year. It had nearly 165 signatories in the last session of Congress, all Democrats, no Republicans, yet to gain the bipartisan support needed to come before the floor. Conyers' efforts built on more than a century of agitation, litigation, and education. In the late 1800s, formerly enslaved African Americans called on the government to recognize the generations of coerced, unremunerated laborers with material forms of assistance. While the effort became entangled with the idea of 40 acres and a mule, the cause of reparations involved more than financial compensation for years of enslavement and equal years of post-emancipation racialized trauma. In fact, African Americans themselves split between the need for financial compensation, educational opportunities, political involvement, and social integration. Some wanted all 4, others highlighted one of the 4 as the single most important path to full citizenship in the United States. notwithstanding those differences, there was this sense, however, that some acknowledgement, some form of restitution, some form of reparations was indeed warranted. Today, in the wake of the public execution of George Floyd and the publicized murder of Breonna Taylor, among others, there has been a renewed call for reparations. It has come in the form of pushes to defund the police, in the form of corporate largesse for past transgressions, in the form of removal of statues and monuments, in name erasures and symbolic acts of inclusion. Somewhat missed in this groundswell of activity has been community-centered efforts to formulate scalable, sustainable, local frameworks for reparations. Some, such as Duke University Professor William Darity, have argued that community-based solutions ignore the federal government's role in devising a national plan with earmarked federal dollars. Certainly, federal involvement is warranted and long overdue. My colleagues and I believe there is not an either-or road to reckoning, and that a humanities approach centered on the contours of local histories is vital to a full and fuller telling and the solutions to follow. As history has shown, oftentimes national action follows strategic work by local actors. That is undeniably one of the lessons to be extracted from the history of the civil rights movement. From Montgomery to Greensboro, Albany to Birmingham, Atlanta to Selma, men, women, and children organized at the local level to achieve change at the national level. Previous instances of community-based reparation solutions may, when combined with strategic and innovative collaboration, serve as models for communities across the country, we believe. One such example follows from the efforts of citizens and community leaders in Evanston, Illinois. Through careful historical research, Evanston came to understand that social policy meant that Black and Brown communities paid an exceptional price for the war on drugs, with higher than anticipated incarceration rates. As a result, it decided to use tax funds from the legalization of marijuana to underwrite investment in and financial resources for its Black and Brown residents. Here, a detailed analysis led to a specific set of solutions. This model is replicable, scalable, and sustainable. Universities and colleges, with their scholars in the lead, can steer similar efforts nationally. Guided by the scholarship on community engagement in social movements, the proposed project that we're working on now aims to combine several dimensions while highlighting how humanities work can simultaneously enhance higher education and the communities in which they are located. Specifically, a national network of 9 colleges and universities, guided on each campus by historians, historical sociologists, and others, will work with community fellows, selected in large measure based on recognized work on matters of race and justice, to co-author local histories and engage key community stakeholders in government, the religious and business sectors, and in other areas in local reparation solutions. Such an approach allows scholars, young and old, to demonstrate the relationship between theory and practice, and to underscore the ways, in this instance, humanities research can and should shape policy solutions and discussions. After all, we can talk about just futures, but just futures require some purposeful action and attention to social policy at all levels. In addition, we aim to highlight the ways that colleges and universities are resources for change at the local level. Through professionally facilitated conversations, we expect to take the findings from the scholars into the community settings in all locales, into churches and synagogues and mosques, to reservations and community centers, anywhere and everywhere that seems important. Those exchanges will result in carefully crowdsourced plans for addressing racial reparation. Once completed, the overall project will produce replicable processes and solutions that other cities and their higher educational institutions can duplicate and modify. To aid the national conversation and to advance the broader mission of community-based reparations, we of course plan a final book as well as a documentary that chronicles the processes and elucidates the recommendations. This project that we have underway requires the careful and critical eye and analytical skills then of a range of scholars, humanists and humanistic social scientists, to be sure. Moreover, we seek to harness the intellectual, personal, political, and economic capital found in colleges and universities, as well as in community partners. And here, just a word about community partners, they have to be full partners. They have to actually have a recognized and dedicated seat at the table, where there are indeed the intellectual workers that we imagine them to be, and the intellectual partners we need them to be. Together, we want to then address the needs for reparations and support community-led efforts to develop reparations plans. As anchor institutions, colleges and universities have the ability to attract a diverse set of actors to drive solutions to complex problems. The intellectual acumen to link the past to the present in formulating solutions, and the influence and staying power to drive permanent, enduring change. These institutions also have their own histories in communities as well. These histories we understand at times will enable and at other times will impair the project as it is currently outlined. So we anticipate that this is not neutral to talk about a college and university in partnership with communities. We have to address our own relationships too if we're going to make this work. Nonetheless, the undergirding theory of change argues that history can be mobilized by scholars to inform the present and help communities craft effective solutions that erase structured inequities. Specifically, then, this project aims to build on university community partnerships to ultimately offer reparations solutions that emanate from the careful exploration of local histories, informed by planned engagements with community members in these 9 or so locations dispersed across the country. We will need the help of historians and historical sociologists, African Americanists, literary historians, and other scholars in these selected colleges and universities, so we can fully mine the local archives and work with community members and municipal officials to identify programs and opportunities that will contribute to just futures for African Americans and in several locations, Native Americans as well. Ideally, such initiatives will relate to workplace development, entrepreneurship, home ownership, education, and infrastructure. And as in Evanston, the goal of the culminating report is to necessitate action by elected community leaders. An important piece of this effort, of course, will involve facilitator-led dialogue sessions that positions community members to co-author the local histories and generate potential solutions. This project and the processes that we're developing are a pivotal shift in recognizing and addressing the wealth and opportunity gaps in African American and Native American communities, and how those gaps are themselves stem from the history of racism and discrimination in this country. Therefore, our efforts will be recorded. And through that recording, we will not only create the documentary previously mentioned, but it is our goal to disseminate it nationwide. Without question, the history of reparations in the United States begins with the displacement of Native peoples, the creation of the institution of slavery, its application to African Americans and implications for Native Americans. As Andres Resendez reminds us in his recent book, The Other Slavery, 2.5 to 5 million Native peoples were also enslaved during the period of chattel slavery. Humanists and social scientists continue to document then the long-term effects, not just of slavery and its abolition, but of segregation as well on the material, social, and psychological well-being of African and Native peoples. Those histories, anchored in a specific place, must be written to secure policy solutions and just futures. And that's the work that we're about. We've given ourselves 3 years to get it done. And so we've just started in year 1. Our first goal is to actually hire a managing director to oversee the day-to-day operations for the 3 to 4 years of the grant. We've already selected the 9 institutions that will be part of this effort, starting from the west, heading east and south, and along the River Valley, Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. Then there's the University of Michigan, and certainly we will be dealing with Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti in Detroit, and most likely Flint. From there, we head east to Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University, which anticipates dealing with Pittsburgh, but also communities in and around Pittsburgh and along the Ohio River Valley. And from Pittsburgh, we make our way due east to Connecticut and Connecticut College. Coming down the eastern seaboard, we find ourselves in Newark at Rutgers University, Newark. And then we go farther south and down to South Carolina, Woodford College in South Carolina. And from there to Macon, Georgia, and Wesleyan College. Finally settling in Atlanta with Emory University and Spelman as being 2 other sites. It is our hope and expectation that that geographic range, although it excludes parts of the West and Southwest, will at least give us things to learn. We're anticipating not only successes, but we're going to have failures and mistakes and mishaps along the way too, which we hope and expect to learn from. In addition to the institutions, there'll be regional directors who will play a role. We anticipate empaneling a group of scholars and experts on social movement to help initial phase of the research design framework. We are and will hold a convening of all the participating institutions and partners so as to be able to really expand our understanding and deepen our understanding of what we all mean by reparations. We will underwrite faculty research, of course. We'll employ graduate and graduate students where appropriate in each of the sites. We will also make full use of an external facilitator and trainer who can deal with tense community and intense community discussions on sensitive topics. We realize people oftentimes talk about race as a third rail in American life. Sometimes it's even higher than that. And so how in this moment of neighbor looking upon neighbor as potential threat, how do we have these conversations about race and equity? We need to be alert to and prepared for the range of reactions in these different communities. And of course, we will employ community fellows, individuals who have already demonstrated a deep knowledge of the community, have actually been working for racial and social change in their communities, who will be an important partner in helping design in each location. And then, of course, Our other partner in this effort that has gone unidentified is our media partner, WQED, Mr. Roger Studio out of Pittsburgh, who will be working with us and have been working with us from the inception to document the range of responses and the things we learn in our multiple locations as we try to actually think through how do we craft a story about just futures that builds on our shared past. That's in year one. By year two, we hope to be deep into this work. We will follow that too with an annual convening. We'll continue to underwrite faculty research and gatherings, and we will crowdsource versions of what we're learning and making sure that there's a ample go-between the scholars and their neighbors in the adjoining and adjacent communities as we try to shape our understanding. Our goal is to bring this project to a conclusion by December of 2023. By that time, we will have finished all of the major reports that talk about what's been learned in each of the communities. We'll conclude with a final convening of all the participating partners and institutions. We will seek, where necessary, to bring closure to all outstanding experiments and all. And we will hopefully expect to conclude then with a final documentary, a draft of it at the very least. But that's not the only thing. We hope then also to begin to share our findings with policymakers and other informed actors across a wide spectrum in the United States. And in fact, what we hope by this time is to be in a position to craft a national message that can crisply and succinctly explain what we learn, why it's important, and what it means. The tangible deliverables would include the development of a general template for community engagement, a summary product that integrates findings from all sites, documentation of best practices across the sites, presentation of findings and recommendations to elected officials in each locale. Here we emphasize not lobbying, but educating. And with that education, we want to be able to detail steps for implementation. As noted, we will host a concluding convening and shape a national message around the local reparations project and what it entails and what it suggests. And then what we hope to do is to produce a series of briefing documents to share with appropriate legislative bodies at the local, state, and federal level, as each is in turn considering what role it can play and should play and must play. There's a sense of urgency here. There is a sense that this is timely, but also there's a sense that something has to be done. In the immediate moments after the police murders and public protests, corporations and individuals pledged millions and millions of dollars of funds to certain groups and specific institutions. While noteworthy and even laudable, such efforts fail to conceptualize a systemic response. This is why we seek to craft democratic futures for a well-coordinated plan where a select number of communities, after grassroots work, develop reparations plans born of their own histories. Such an approach is scalable, will lead to resolutions in several locations across the country, encourage calls for replication, and may, and I underscore may, spur national involvement. If we're successful in any one of these areas, let alone all of them, we believe this will redound to the benefit of all. Now, the project that I have just described spotlights humanists and social scientists. But let me be clear, there is work for faculty from across the university to undertake in this zone. For example, a discussion of water insecurity, which is a reparations question, demands the help of engineers and geographers. It is impossible to address the future work without centering computer scientists, technologists, economists, and psychologists. If any of you spend just a little bit of time, you can begin to see the need for, at the very least, a multidisciplinary team, if you're talking about community-based reparations, if not a truly interdisciplinary team. Here I leave it to you to think about how to define the problem to be addressed, and then settle on the composition of the actors to address it. But let me also offer a few hints. 4 decades ago, the historian James Borchert published his profoundly important study of alley life in Washington, D.C. His book told the story of African Americans who resided in the alleyways that dotted the Georgetown section of your city. In sampled neighborhoods, African Americans accounted for 1/3 of the residents, but only about 9% of the street side residents. Yet they accounted for 93% of the alley dwellers. As such, so much of their lives remained invisible to all around. Their existence functioned as both metaphor and sociology. As metaphor, the alley dwellers exposed what it meant to be visibly invisible, seen but seldom recognized. In the homes of employers, along the broad streets of the capital, away from the alleys, others saw their Black bodies traverse the cityscape. In those spaces, a broader narrative about Blacks in Washington, D.C. kicked in, and both racial and racist assumptions played roles. In those places, their sociological selves took shape as their metaphorical selves moved more and more to the margins. I briefly share the story of Washington's Black alley dwellers because their histories map onto the history of the nation's capital and onto the history of American University. What if American University committed itself to asking, what would racial reparations look like if we started with where Borchert left off, retracing the lives and histories of those who lived in plain view, but off the main streets? Where would you start? A year ago, in an article in Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, I suggested that liberal arts education was ripe for a 2.0 reinvention. Building on the claims of the American Association of Colleges and Universities, AAC&U, and its LEAP initiative, which calls for the liberal arts in the service of the nation's interests. One way to prepare for the future and to ensure students are both robot ready and robot proof is to restructure the curriculum. And I think you can do that in tandem to thinking about racial reparations. This means broad exposure to the liberal arts in the first year, domain knowledge acquisition in years 2 and 3, that is subject area or broad content area, and the application of that knowledge in year 4, where you're actually taking it and working on some concrete problem, project, etc. Imagine that model fully loaded, with your students doing work in the nation's interest, while also asking new questions informed by community partners about race, racism, and reparations. Such work may invite new dialogue about what is anti-racist as compared to non-racist. We sometimes have a slippage in our language. Anti-racist, non-racist, are they really the same? But such work would advance our understanding and enhance how your students learn as well. And so they actually begin to not just think about theory, but actually think through of what is then the sort of framework for this theory. There are other possibilities too. In his recently published book, Madness in the City of Magnificent Intentions, historian Martin Summers takes us into the world of Black men and women whose encounters with slavery and Jim Crow left them injured psychologically. He tells the story of their lives at St. Elizabeth, the nation's national capital's mental hospital. When we talk about reparations, often we think in terms of material loss, wages, labor, land, equipment, etc. Seldom do we really think about the emotional and psychological toll extracted by generations of exploitation. Now, we in the Academy bear some responsibility for this, of course. Our research decisions, theses, and emphases play a role in what is known and how it is known. For more than a generation, scholars have told the story of Black resistance and triumph. While an exceedingly important intervention at the time first introduced, it leaves little room for something more. Moreover, it risks painting African Americans as more than human. In fact, as superhuman indeed. Superhumans need no assistance, we're told. Superhumans warrant little compensation, we're led to understand. Superhumans should garner meager support from others, we're advised. Instead, as superhumans, they are praised and feared. They're praised and feared for being superhuman. Now is the time for a shift in focus, I would argue, to balance out the superhuman motif with some exploration also of Black vulnerability, even in the face of resources and being resourceful and being able to resist. After all, rather than being superhuman, endowed with the physical gifts of the mythic John Henry, most men and women lived remarkably human existences. They cried and laughed, hungered and felt sated. They yearned and they were satisfied. They grew frustrated and expressed anger. They drank too much and lost themselves in Jesus. They made love, told lies, and dreamt of a better world for themselves and their children. Mostly, they lived and they died. And through it all, they struggled to maintain their mental health. Can we imagine a new set of studies spearheaded by this university that builds on the work of Summers and takes seriously African American mental illness and mental health in the age of Jim Crow? Knowledge production is its own addition to the reparations framework, after all. So as I draw to a conclusion, let me offer this. An institution can begin to address its racial past by asking how its development or spread shaped housing opportunities for Black residents of the city, of the district. Many colleges and universities with older histories have discovered a racial analog that it heretofore claimed it lacked. Here we only need think of Johns Hopkins in his recent pronouncements. But almost no urban institution can claim that redlining, eminent domain, and other public policies didn't shape its history. And at the local or federal level, that history was not shaped by racist policies. Individual calls to minimize microaggressions in classroom settings and across campus, to stop overt expressions of racist behaviors such as hostile signage and cyberbullying, or questionable encounters with public safety figures. All of these prompt a great deal of attention on and off campus. Unquestionably, there is much work to do in each and every one of these domains and others that I have not even referenced today. But today, I'm inviting higher education to imagine it has a role to play in charting racial reparations. On its own, American University can join this effort and lead the change that's demanded. I say to you, hear the call, accept the challenge, lead the way, and in so doing, stay true to your mission to, quote, advance knowledge, foster intellectual curiosity, build community, and empower lives of purpose, service, and leadership. I end by saying, I hope you will. I end by saying, the world is watching. Thank you. Now let's turn to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for being in community with us today and to helping us think beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to make the case for reparations. I'm personally excited about your work that will result in some research-informed reparation plans, and particularly ones that are born out of community histories.
Yeah.
We've been through quite a bit as a nation, and your work is both timely and needed. Really quickly, everyone, I'm Brian McGowan. I am an associate professor in the School of Education, where I also serve as the Associate Director for Pedagogy and Higher Education Research in our Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning. For everyone who has tuned in, feel free to post questions in the Q&A box, and I will get to as many of them as we can. And with that being said, let's jump right in. In terms of this call for AU to be a part, what initial steps can we take as a campus to move beyond DEI efforts and engage in anti-racism and racial reparations work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first part is actually to name it, Brian, just as you did, to say, we recognize that we have some work to do on the DEI front. I mean, and that will remain an issue. You got to have numbers. Nancy Cantor and I, who's the chancellor of Rutgers Newark, posted a piece a week ago or so on Medium saying, look, coming out of the events on January 6th, there's this whole story about numbers and race and racism that we need to disentangle. And so I'm the first one to say the diversity piece, the numbers piece is important, but somehow we never get to the equity piece in so many of our institutions. We get stuck on equality, but equality is not the same thing as equity. And some folks would say, all right, we get to diversity, then to inclusion, and then over time, we'll get to something that looks like equity. And I would argue that the interaction between diversity and inclusion begins to approximate equity, but it's a multiplication sign rather than a plus sign in this equation. If you sort of think about how we would map mathematically an equation. And too many of us actually is diversity plus inclusion equals equity. And that's the wrong equation. And so part of that is to sort of think about that piece, but then asking, so what? Still, if you think only about 33 to 36% of Americans have post-secondary degrees in the United States. The majority of people who actually encounter our institutions encounter them through one of three ways, who don't either work there or go to school there. They either are a patient in one of our hospitals, if we have hospitals. They attend one of our sporting events if we have big time sports. Or they know someone, they walk on campus just to see and feel and experience that. But they know oftentimes, as Black residents in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti who are not affiliated with the university said to me, and others, Black faculty at the University of Michigan, they know they're marked as outsiders from the moment they walk on campus. And so that invites a whole different kind of interrogation on our part. If our neighbors already know they're marked as outsiders, be it by dress, speech, or whatever, and as my colleague Al Young just finished a book on African-American workers in Ypsilanti that was just published. And what was revealing in there is that several people said in this book that even if I knew I needed new skills or training, I wouldn't come on campus to get it because I'm actually essentially fearful of coming on campus. So that's the place to start. I mean, start with your neighbors and ask, so how do your neighbors perceive you? Are you viewed as a good neighbor, or are you perceived with threat and danger? And interrogate that question. What does that mean? If your neighbors perceive you as threat and danger? Because therein begins the story of writing those histories that we're talking about.
That's interesting, thinking about so often on university campuses, we design programs, practices, initiatives, and we don't always think about our stakeholders and how we are perceived. So I like how you're pushing us in that direction.
Well, I mean, can I just, and I'll add one little piece.
Yeah,
I mean, even down to signage. I mean, I can still remember, I joked with Cornell about this about 30 years ago. I was giving a talk at Princeton, and I was trying to find my way to where I was gonna give a talk, and I realized Princeton was actually coded inside and outside of culture. Because there were no visible names on buildings and there were no wayfinders. And so it's if you belonged there, you knew where to go. And if you were an outsider, you were on your own to figure it out, or someone may tell you where to go. And so when I became provost at Emory, I discovered that we had the same problem. We were inward looking. The architecture was inward looking. The signage was inward looking. And so we did very little to invite people from the outside in, because once you were in, you were then informed. And so we went about, I and my colleague Mike Mandel, who was the EVP for Finance Administration, went about a major campaign of redirecting signage. In fact, building one building that was actually, one new building that was outward looking rather than inward looking, so that we could begin to tell folks in the community that this was not just a place apart from them. This is a place that we understood needed to be integrated more fully into community.
Also appreciate that suggestion as well. It makes me think about broader conversations around campus ecology, and just into that very point, you talked about interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approaches to doing this work. One of the questions that's come in is, do you see a role for geospatial information services, like including map making and telling the story of this Crafting Democratic Futures project?
Oh, the short answer is yes. The longer and more elaborate answer is to get, especially if you begin to try to tell which story. So let me give one. As an example. There was a recent piece that came out on Native American land dispossession, and the article went on to explain that every public university in the United States that was created as a result of the Morrill Act, the Land Grant Act, came as a result of the confiscation of Native American lands. And so in some ways, it's almost impossible to think about the burgeoning land grant college system in the United States without thinking about a loss if you are from various Native American communities. You can only see that if you map it. You actually can't. There's a case of my colleagues who in Minnesota who are going to be working with Native American communities understand almost right off that we're going to need geography and we're going to need geospatial mapping there. We could do the same thing about water. I was in a conversation yesterday with a geographer about mapping water and flooding and trying to understand where people live. So if you're a literary scholar, you'll read Toni Morrison or someone else and they'll talk about Black bottoms. But if you end up applying that to Black communities across the United States, you'll find they were low-lying areas in almost every urban locale, oftentimes near water. That's why they were Black bottoms, and they were prone to flooding. Be interesting to actually do a national map there of that kind of geography to see what it looks like in each of the communities that we're looking at. We have a project right now that we're anticipating on what we call the third slavery, which begins to look at the 27 to 40 million people worldwide today in some form of involuntary servitude, and understanding that while we think slavery ended in the end of the 19th century worldwide. There are actually more people today in some form of involuntary servitude than was true at the end of the 19th century. But what we don't know is whether or not those metropoles and those terminus points for enslavement in the 19th century map onto 21st century locations. And so we're trying to begin to say, okay, so let's take two maps. We know where a lot of this activity is happening in the United States. How many of them were also slave ports in the 19th century? To begin to actually put in conversation two different moments in human history, but yet the ways in which we continue to maintain and activate old transportation networks for similar purposes.
Yeah, I appreciate that example. And for those who are tuning in, I'm hoping that folks are making connections, like how can I do my part within my sphere of influence, right? That was an example around geospatial information services, but what does that look like across other disciplines? And hopefully folks are beginning to think in those ways. Yeah. In terms of thinking about others, there's a question that has come in. Is there any way that AU students could become involved in this project? So at the student level, what can students do?
Well, I snuck it in there. It was. I mean, I'm sure Vernon, you heard it, but I was suggesting a pretty radical restructure of the educational experience for AU students and all American higher education students, particularly those who are being educated in the broad liberal arts. But I would say anyone at the undergraduate level, where broad exposure in the first years, and then deep content knowledge in years 2 and 3. But when actually in year 4, instead of being in the classroom, you're actually in a community or in a lab, or you're someplace in a work setting where you're actually taking that and applying that in real ways. And so for the student asking this question, are there projects that they would want to use to demonstrate that they are understanding of, and you name the field, where they're doing it in collaboration with either individual faculty members or larger research collectives that are working on topics, and where their piece is a additive and not and salient piece to the overall puzzle. But I am hopeful, because I actually think that one of the great challenges for higher education, generally speaking, and for it and the ways in which we approach it, is that we do need to prepare our students more forcefully than we have to be both robot ready and robot proof. Man, I keep saying there's the rare human being who is not at this moment enabled by some robotic device. So it's there, it's not going anywhere, but how do you actually make sure that you have the set of skills that will allow you to adapt and change with new emerging technologies, new ways of understanding the world. And for someone like myself, trained as a historian, this was brought home probably about 20 years ago. I was in a conversation with some friends of mine in computer science. And I just asked them, so what's a computer science generation these days? And they go, oh, about 18 months. And I thought, okay, I'm still here in the analog world where I still think of a generation as 25 years. And you're telling me that in this, my world and your world are colliding, where there's a way in which we talk about generations in 25 years, but we live in generations now in 18 months.
Interesting. It makes me also think, you had mentioned, are there projects, right? To the student who posed that question, it makes me think about broader discussions around teaching and pedagogy, right? So in order for there to be projects, there has to also be assignments or also initiatives that can be created for students to engage in these types of projects. So again, this reimagining or this re-envisioning of education, it also are thinking about faculty as well, if we want to push the needle around racial equity and thinking about justice.
Yeah, I mean, it's powerfully so. There's a way in which this moment is right for those who want to reimagine what they do. So let's say, talk about the humanities. So you're a historian, let's say. Why couldn't you and your colleagues sort of create a humanities laboratory and where you're actually working on problems, questions, research questions in the community, and where students actually learning what it means to actually engage in those questions by going to archives, interviewing people, doing and looking at old materials. I mean, the great thing, certainly in a non-COVID world, with all the federal agencies right there in Washington, D.C., there's a whole lot of raw material, they say, that could be mined if you were creating such an undertaking. But it also, you can garner, I think, external support for this as well. It's the kind of activities where others will help to underwrite it because it really is allowing students to really demonstrate the ways in which their learning is informing their own engagements with these larger sets of questions.
Yeah. I'm looking in the, there's lots of compliments to your talk here. So folks are thanking you
Yeah.
for your contributions today. One of the questions here in thinking about participatory research in particular and partnerships, what might be the role of participatory research partnerships between faculty, students, and residents in agenda setting for AU reparations actions in our own city?
Yeah, no, I love that question. And as an outsider who, neither Peter nor Sylvia and I have never had this conversation about what may be top of mind, and nor my nephew who went to graduate school at AU. And so I'm going to offer this without any informed elements. And so the questioner and others can tell me if this makes any sense. First is actually, there are three levels of questions in that question. One is about how to go about it, figuring out an overall structure at AU to engage multiple players in participatory research. Faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, community partners. And there starts with a question about trust and intent. So given an example, probably now close to 2 decades ago, when I was dean of the graduate school at the University of Michigan, I convened with my colleague Barry Checkaway, who headed our essentially Center for Community Partnerships. We brought in community leaders from Detroit and had them sit down at the table as equals with 17 of the 19 deans of 17 of the 19 schools and colleges. And we were having a whole conversation about this very question. How do you begin to even do it? And I remember to this day, this one powerful community leader in Detroit looked and says, you know what? We're tired. And she says, we're not just tired of all the stuff we have to deal with, but we're tired of you. And I remember I said, okay, now this is going to be good. And so she went on to say, it's not that we're tired of interacting with you. We value that, but we're tired of being the subjects of your studies and the objects of your studies. If you really want to partner with us, we want to be the co-authors of your studies. And I remember sitting there and I looked around the room at my colleagues because that was ground setting and shifting at the same time, because here was someone who was saying to the decanal leadership at the University of Michigan circa 2000 that if we have intellectual knowledge, we are intellectual workers, but you don't treat us as intellectual workers. That you come in at your expense when there's money there, do your projects, drop in, drop out, as if the only expertise is your expertise, and that we have no expertise to offer. And so I think going back to your colleague raising this question, AU and all of American higher education, if they're going to really be effective, I have to ask the question, can I change the vectors of power sufficiently enough who actually think of these folks in these communities as true partners? Can they indeed be the co-authors of the study rather than just a subject or object of the study? So that's one place to start. The next place then is about the reward system,
Huh.
because then you have to begin to ask, how do you begin to think through the reward system? And so, because I had in multiple locations, I've had junior people say, you know, Dean Lewis, Professor Lewis, Provost Lewis, President Lewis, no matter whatever title I had at the moment, um, I'm not sure that I'm getting the right signals that this is going to be worth my while. And in fact, what we almost always said, wait till you get tenure before you engage in participatory research in communities. And that needs to change too. Because then we're sending the wrong signals to say that certain kind of work is only worthy for people who have certain kinds of profiles. Others need to essentially still prove that they are apprentices, and we can justify their continued presence among us. And so there's that reward system that has to be tackled if we're going to fully deal with it. And then the third piece, and I'll get off of this, is time. Because in working in community-based research, the time schedule that we have, 5 years or 6 years for tenure, promotion, and whatever, may not map onto real situation and real conditions in communities across the country. And so if we're trying to design this to map onto that, to our timeline, we may start in a faulty place. And so there is some urgency and need to think through then all of that. And that is respect, that is rewards, and then time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. There's a lot of questions coming in around like promotion and tenure as it relates to these pieces. So some context for you here at ADU, we have assembled a task force recently to revisit thinking about broader issues of DEI and how that has shown up in our P&T standards across the board, but in particular thinking about COVID-19 and the role that that has played in thinking about productivity during this time. A question I would have for you in this whole reimagining process, how could we reimagine our reward structures for faculty to incorporate some of the content that you've offered us today around reparations? How could we reimagine our P&T processes and reward structures?
Yeah, so instead of going into it in great depth, and so I'm going to glance over it, but suggest to the audience that they may want to go back and look at a document prepared by Imagining America about 7-8 years ago. Imagine America is a national project. And what they ended up doing was actually suggesting to colleges and universities how they may be able to restructure their P&T process in light of community engaged research and scholarship. And so, and they spent 2 years studying and writing on this. And so there's a succinct place to go, and for those who want to probe it more fully. Part of what I will say today is this. The university, a university I learned over more than almost 4 decades now, is a loose coalition. And so the standards in one area are not replicated by the expectations and standards in another. Yeah. And so public health has one set of expectations, medicine another, sociology a third, education a fourth, and you sort of go across the school and the university. And so part of what you have to do, and I think part for the scholars here, is twofold. Is one, to ask the question, what and how does the unit understand what it means to be productive and to be making exceptional contributions to whatever the field? Because that's an important, because if you don't answer that question, you can't get to the next question, which is, how then do we accommodate individuals who don't look like everyone else, or who want to actually work in an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary way, which is not standard in this unit? Because you need to ask yourself about what you think are your core features before you can then ask, is it possible for us to accommodate someone who doesn't actually look like the rest of us? Because the worst thing you could do is answer yes to question 2 without ever fully probing question 1. So that means then what you end up doing is potentially using and misusing that scholar who comes in thinking they have a clear path to do what they want. But when it's already loaded here on the other side saying, oh no, we only do A. And you want to do A minus a B, you don't belong with us. But it's implicit rather than explicit, and creates all kinds of challenges for everyone.
All right. Speaking of these challenges, and so again, I'm encouraged by the work that you're doing, and look forward to seeing how it evolves. But not everyone, I imagine, is on board with the work that you're doing. Right?
I'm sure not.
And so what challenges, naysayers, or resistance to the idea of reparations have you faced along the way, and how did you address them?
Yeah, so fortunately, the work is early on. The grant was just announced. It's actually from the Mellon Foundation, so it was just announced, and our work is going. What's fascinating to me in some ways, last summer, reset the dial just a little bit, because almost no college or university leader that I spoke to, and I've spoken to quite a few, wanted to be on the wrong side of history. And so they came to understand that some attention to anti-racism, some attention to reparations, some attention was all the more important. Now, I oftentimes will ask them, I said, okay, so in a world of reduced budget allocation, are you still making that full commitment to DEI? If this is one way for you to show that your rhetoric is matched by your purse strings. And I'm not going to out any people, but there are institutions across the United States that are still wrestling with that question. I was in a meeting with a collection of college presidents a few weeks ago, and where, without again identifying an institution, where it was clear that in some instances, presidents said to me, their board, not all members of their board were fully behind engaging in work that would look like work related to racial reparations. That some board members worried that doing so would signal that they were ignoring, excluding, or blaming other members of the community. And so there's work to be done at the board level for sure in some of our institutions, sometimes at the administration level, sometimes down to the schooling unit level, then down to the individual faculty members level. And when I came back to the University of Michigan, because I have been around the block more than once, I carefully chose the institutions I wanted to work with in this partnership. And so we have not at this point run into head-on interference in ways that we can imagine. Now, as you can glean from my talk, I do anticipate once we go into the community, and I live in Michigan, people show up with their guns at the State House. And so, I can anticipate that someone could become vocal in their opposition to any conversation about reparations. As we were talking offline, born and raised in Virginia when I was, and some of my neighbors in Virginia still fly the old battle flag and not the new ones from Walmart. And so there are deeply entrenched attitudes about race and place in American life that I think once we move into communities, we will experience in a profound way. And we're anticipating that.
Yeah. For those who are bringing in questions, there's lots of questions here. Just heads up, we will not be able to get to all of them. So I just want to name that, but there's some other themes that are emerging.
Okay.
Here with the questions. And so a quick one around your project. Many people want to know, can institutions and students outside of your network get involved, or should they be starting their own versions of this project grounded in their local context?
I would actually recommend the latter. You can certainly call us and we'll be willing to apprise you of what we're doing, et cetera. And there may be room on occasion to hire interns and other kinds of things and all. So I don't want to dissuade people from reaching us directly. But part of, to be honest, I mean, there's a part of me now is like a proselytizer, which is to say, we have an idea, but we want to give it away to everyone. So think about how your own institution, even outside, can actually begin to do this kind of work. Because what we know is that grassroots activities themselves, informed by local communities, have a certain kind of traction. And we hope that other funders, I mean, Mellon is underwriting this, but we hope other funders will come behind us, behind Mellon, and will underwrite as well. So if you're already beginning to do that, my guess is some of those that are saying they're about to stand up will maybe be in a position to support the work.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot a bit here, and I'm going to read this one actually verbatim.
Okay.
And again, thank you, Dr. Lewis, for your inspiring work and message to our community today. I think many of us who study the history of racism were taken aback by President Trump's so-called 1776 project for many reasons. But perhaps above all, because of the attempt of the highest levels of the American state to minimize the history of racism, and racial injustice. How do you suggest that we make sense of the 1776 project for our students and colleagues? Was this an essential threat to the anti-racist project or a dangerous aberration from decades of progress?
So thank you for that question. It is not an aberration, I would say. And in fact, it is part of a thread in American political and social discourse that has a long, long history. So if you go back, my colleague and friend, Jim Grossman, who is the executive director of the American Historical Association there in Washington, D.C., I think has commented on the record that the authors of the 1776 report seem to misinterpret American history, but not in a way that most people have seen it. I mean, what Jim highlights is that they end up with this sort of monocausal explanation for everything. It had to be A. It couldn't be A, B, C, or D. That it couldn't. The tension couldn't be between freedom and slavery. The tension, the thesis has to be about freedom. Well, most American historians will say is that the notion of freedom and slavery animated a great deal of American history from 1619 forward. Many American historians, if not most, will argue that it's impossible to tell the story without telling the story of race. For those who argue that somehow 1619 and the 1619 Project in the New York Times was some kind of radical reinterpretation of American history, it's like, I'm sorry. For those of us who were educated in the 1960s in Virginia, we learned about 1619 even in those segregated textbooks. And so this is not like this is a new introduction into our understanding of the American past. What that project suggested and what 1776 suggests is that American history has always had more than one theme to shape it. And I think for your colleague in teaching to their students is actually have them think back through the competing visions of America that have really found expression at one point or another in time. And I'll end with a little story, I mean, just to remind, which is to say, I got involved. I mean, one of the reasons that slavery and its aftermath is one of the themes of our center started as a result of a moment in 2016. I've been thinking about this before, but I was living in New York at that time. I was still president of the Mellon Foundation. I was driving from New York down to our house in Virginia Beach, and flash flood. And so for those, anybody on the Eastern Shore of Virginia going on the highway, understand, so you're off the main path, and all of a sudden off the main path, there were a lot of signs for then candidate Trump, which you didn't see on the main road. It was a mile off. And I thought that was interesting. I get back on 213 and heading into the Bay Bridge Tunnel and Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, and get into Virginia Beach, and I'll come back. So middle of July, there was an encounter on the subways in New York City between a Black woman and a white guy. And it was one of those moments for anybody who lived in New York. It's like the most democratic moment in any given second in New York City. Namely, who's going to get their backside on this on the subway chair first?
Right.
I mean, it's the most democratic of all moments, right? Well, the Black woman did. The white guy, I can still see in the video clips, who was in a linen suit and a straw hat, begins to berate her for taking his seat. And she's like, I'm sorry, but how is this your seat? This is New York. It's the L train from Brooklyn into Manhattan. I just got my backside on the seat faster than you. And so they have an exchange. And at some point, no one intervenes, but 4 people take videos of it and post it. And at some point, he says to her, well, I'm a Trump supporter. And she said, okay. I mean, that just told me more about you than anything else you said so far, but okay. But then it didn't end there. What he said was, and when Trump gets elected, he's going to send you all back to the fields. Although he used an expletive in moderating and modifying fields. And she looked at him, and then his friend finally said, shut up, guy, to be quiet. But I sat there and I remember at that moment, how is it in 2016, in a competition over a subway seat, that all of a sudden, in an attempt, and no pun intended, that when you are losing out in every other way, your Trump card is a reference to slavery. And so that teaching moment reminded me of the importance of saying, okay, no matter what other people may say, it's there. We're using it, and we better use it well, because the misuse of it continues to perpetuate a whole set of inequalities. And you know, and I remember writing at the time about it, and I go, somebody should tell this guy that the political economy of the United States has changed since the end of the 19th century. Right now, we're going to eliminate upwards of 30 million people as laborers. We don't need folks in the field. So his notion was out of time and out of place, but it was racially anchored there. And I think for your colleague, it is those moments juxtaposed to the 1776 project is about the high tension over whose narrative and whose version of American history should stand.
Yeah. Everyone, if we can give a virtual round of applause, and thanks to Dr. Lewis for your time today. We really appreciate you posing questions to help us think about the work that we're doing here at AU around these efforts. So thank you so much in being in the community with us. There are so many questions that came in the queue. I apologize we were not able to get to them, but thank you once again. This was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That was terrific.
That was wonderful.
Really, really solid, just proposal for how we should reimagine the future. And I'm just very excited for you. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're excited.
What Melanie said, and then some. I mean, we could sit down and pick your brain about what we're doing and the way we can inflect it and such for hours after that. So we really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Yeah.
And I think the community relationships and also the community members telling you we want to be co-authors is something that a lot of faculty here take to heart, given that DC residents, DC nonprofits have also been studied the heck out of, and now it's sort of time for that equal footing and, you know, being equal partners at the table. And I think that's really, really very resonant.
And I
Okay.
think, you know, at the very beginning, I was wondering, I say this as a humanist, Earl, but I was wondering, is, you know, why the privileging of the humanities? But in a sense, I think the humanities, we see this, I don't know if you were in the Mellon when you funded the humanities truck that goes out into the community, but I think the humanities have a little bit less of that subject object problem that social sciences sometimes do. And I think that's one of the real strengths of this project, is that it begins to sort of break that down in a very serious way.
Yeah, and in this case, to be honest, Peter, my friends at Mellon said, we're only going to fund this, Earl, if you center the humanities. And I said, no problem, I can do that. And so I wanted to illustrate in a concrete way with specifics how we're doing it with the humanities. And some humanists and social scientists, but they were very explicit. Said, Earl, we know you tend to be Catholic in your view about who can participate, but we're only going to fund this if you behave. And I said, okay.
Well, you know, you know the limitations of what Mellon can and cannot do better than anybody, I think.
I do. I do.
I have to run, but really, this was fantastic. And Mellon,
Okay.
thank you for all that the center has done to support it. And there's a lot of, I mean, Earl, you haven't seen all the questions, but there's a lot of people, including trustees and a lot of really great faculty from here and from Georgetown and elsewhere, who are really sort of resonating with your talk, which really is what we want the center to be doing.
Oh, that's great. I think I'm on a board with one of your trustees, and so
With Jeff Syme.
with Jeff, I'll see Jeff tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, this was another one, Tom Gottschalk. He's a terrific, very, like Jeff, a very, very thoughtful trustee. You know, boards of trustees, you can have people like Tom and Jeff on boards, you're really ahead of the game.
Yeah, no, thoughtful trustees are worth their weight in gold. I've seen it go both ways. I'm no longer chair of the Concordia board. I stepped down in September, and so I'm 12 years and I'm done. But being the chair of the board, I realized was almost as hard as being the president. Not quite big, but trying to keep colleagues focused on the right things.
Yeah, no, it's really true. Anyway, thank you. Really appreciate it. And do stay in touch, please.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you so much to Brian as well, and Dr. Lewis.
Yeah, Brian, thank
Kelsey,
you.
Dylan, thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Stay well,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.